You're going to see a number of things in this short videotape that's coming up. A lot of the focus is on season extension. Hoop houses, homemade hoop houses, high tunnels, structures like that allow you to bring crops like this to market several weeks early. And that's all the rage and absolutely key to making a farm more profitable and to helping build local farmers markets. More products earlier in the season, it's good for the farmer, good for the community. But you're also going to learn about other things besides season extension in this tape. For instance, the foundation of good farming, which is healthy soil. So we're going to spend a little time talking about how do you build up soil, whether you have an old tobacco farm like we have or a new farm that you've just bought. Now, in addition to that, we're going to talk a little bit about the element of planning. It's great to have hoop houses and high tunnels, but if you don't plan, if you don't start your seeds in January and February, the hoop houses and high tunnels don't do you a whole lot of good. So you'll really get hopefully three basic lessons from this tape. First, about season extension. Secondly, about a healthy farm with a focus on the soil. And lastly, just a good nod to the idea of planning and preparation so that you make the most of what you have, your ground, your landscape, and your structures, your season extension. So this is an example of cover cropping. When you are farming organically, farming sustainably, the most important thing of a lot of important things you need to do is build up your soil. This farm was an old tobacco farm when we bought it about 13 years ago. Soil was quite depleted, very small amount of organic matter, very hard soil, hard packed clay. And so what we've been doing the last 13 years is a combination of composting, mulching with organic material, and cover cropping. And right here is an example of a fall planted cover crop, mostly crimson clover is what you see, the very pretty purplish red crimson blossoms mixed in with an occasional little bit of rye. That was all sown back in early October, grew up just a little bit before the cold weather, and then has done most of its growth in the last 2 months. And it's about ready to till in. I'm going to be tilling this into the ground in the next week, basically, to prepare for the next batch of crops. The crimson clover is a type of cover crop that's a legume. And a legume, whether it's clover, vetch, alfalfa, beans, peas, they have this amazing ability to take nitrogen out of the air, which we have abundant nitrogen in the air, and make it available to their own roots, but also to the soil microbes and others. So they fix nitrogen or pull it out of the air. Other plants can't do that. So this is a drip irrigation system. We use drip irrigation on practically everything we grow. It's called drip irrigation because the water literally drips from tiny slits in the tape every 12 inches. Right here you can see water dripping down onto the mulch there. Generally speaking, the drip tape goes actually underneath of the mulch, is where it's supposed to be. And so that way, as the water flows through the tape, it goes directly onto the soil and right to the root zone of the plant. So you don't waste the water as you would with the sprinkler system, because with sprinkler, much of the water misses your target. A lot of it that lands on the plant or the soil is evaporated before it has a chance to be taken up by the plant roots. In a drip system, much less water is used to deliver the same amount to the plants. In a raised bed, if we had two rows per bed, we would have a single line of drip tape right down the middle of the 2 rows. You'll see that in the broccoli and cauliflower. For the onions and garlic and other things with 3 or 4 rows, we use 2 lines of drip tape so that every row of plants has access to the water. We plant the garlic, like everything basically on the farm, in a raised bed system. Once the beds are made, in the case of garlic, onions, and other cool weather crops, lettuce, broccoli, we do not use plastic mulch. We use plastic mulch for warm weather crops. So once the beds are made, we add our compost and other nutrients to it. You can see a little compost on the surface here. And then we plant them. And in the raised bed system, you can plant 3 and even 4 rows in one space that's only a little wider than a traditional row. The traditional way of planting would have been to have one row of garlic, move over about 4 feet, have another row of garlic, move over another 4 or 5 feet, another row of garlic. Same with onions, same with lettuce. Well, in this system, we're getting 3 rows of garlic in a space only slightly bigger than the one. And actually the garlic prefers it because the raised bed is essentially concentrated topsoil. So the plants grow better even though there's more of them. Weed control is also simpler in raised beds because the plants tend to shade out some of the weeds themselves. You have actually less weeding in a raised bed than you have with a traditional row system. So it's again, has a lot of advantages. The soft, concentrated topsoil for the plants and their roots, the fact that you can get 2 to 3 times as much in the same area, and that they grow better nevertheless, and that you reduce the amount of space that you're having to cultivate, mulch, or hand pull weeds. So all the way around, raised bed system's a great thing. Here in this, what we call a low tunnel, similar to a high tunnel but a little bit shorter, I've actually never covered it this year. Last year I had tomatoes and whatnot in this area, grew them covered. This year, because the spring's been so warm, I haven't needed to cover the crops we've had in here. What you see here is broccoli and cauliflower, about 5 different types of cauliflower, 2 or 3 types of broccoli. Again, planted in the raised beds. You can see here 2 rows per bed. 2 rows per bed. That's because broccoli and cauliflower are a much bigger plant than the garlic and onions we saw. Still, we get a lot in one area. And what I want to show here is that these are doing really quite well. They're off to a very good start. They will be making heads starting in about 2 to 3 weeks. We'll have white cauliflower, orange, purple. We'll have broccoli. So very good looking plants here, the broccoli and cauliflower. However, I want to compare these plants with the ones we put into the hoop house at about the same time and show you the difference that a little extra heat from the hoop house made. Here we have the same planting system, raised beds, 2 rows per bed, the same mix of varieties of several types of cauliflower and a couple types of broccoli. The only difference between these and those is that these were planted in a hoop house, and they were planted about 4 days earlier. But you have a difference in planting of 4 days. You have a difference in growth of more like 2.5 to 3 weeks. So broccoli and cauliflower, they're not heat-loving plants, but in the very early spring, these were planted about March 5th. It's now April 20th. In the early spring, even cool season plants like broccoli, lettuce, cauliflower, they love a little extra heat. So this is our heirloom tomato tunnel this year. Last year we had things not in the tomato family because we rotate crops to try to minimize disease pressure and insects. This year we have about 350 tomato plants inside this one tunnel. We have another couple of structures that will have tomatoes in them. The plants, as you can see, are doing quite well. We just recently suckered them, which means removing the little growths that come at the node of every branch. That way we get a couple of strong stems with nice big tomatoes instead of dozens and dozens of stems making it into a bush. I've had these tunnels for a number of years. I've built new ones every so often. I never liked the end walls. A lot of people struggle with the end walls. That's the part at each end that you have to be able to open to allow air in and close to be able to keep the cold out on a cold night. The end walls that came with these tunnels were zippers. The zippers broke. They flapped around like crazy in the wind. I just didn't like them. So last year we came up with a new design. We worked with the folks at Farm Tech to piece together the materials and come up with our own design. And my farm manager, Laura, and I built these end walls for each of our tunnels. You can see it's quite sturdy. It has a 4x4 post at either end, and then a 4x4 that goes across the top. It's a 20-foot wide span. That allows me to get my tractor in and out, whether I'm tilling or shaping the beds. And then the end wall itself is made out of this heavy, opaque plastic material. We're not worried about light coming through. That's a pretty good insulator. And that is held onto a roll bar between the wooden post and this 1 1/4 inch piece of steel. To roll it up and down, we just use the crank mechanism. goes all the way to the ground. We can pull the flap out and on a cold night really cover it up. We also have little strings here that we can use to go around there to hold it in place. Again, it kind of makes it a tighter seal, keeps it from the wind on a heavy windy night from blowing apart. And then when it comes time to open it, in order to be able to let the air in on a warm day, again, a very simple matter of cranking it. As much as we want to go. If we're running the tractor through, we'd go up a little bit higher and be able to get in and out without bumping into it. So a very simple system, cost about $400 per end wall. It will last for many years with the lumber, the steel, and this. We're very pleased with this, a big improvement. So high tunnels are wonderful. We have a number of them on the farm. They produce tremendous results, but they're expensive. They'll run $6,000 to $8,000 depending on the type you get for 100-foot long by 30-foot wide. Definitely worth the investment. However, for a lot of folks that's too much money or an awful lot of money to put out. So years ago I came up with this design, a simple homemade hoop house, I call it, made out of basically fiberglass ground posts, PVC hoops, 1 1/4 inch PVC, and then a combination of plastic and what's called floating row cover for frost protection. Earlier in the video you may have seen the images of the broccoli and cauliflower plants that were so large. Those are in one of these hoop houses. So this is a completed hoop house over here, 100 foot by about 14 foot, so it's roughly half the square footage of the high tunnels. Not a snow-worthy structure. You don't want to try to carry these through the winter, but for early season extension, they're fantastic. What we're going to do right now is show you how we construct these simple hoop houses. Very, very easy. Takes just a few hours with a couple of people working. Really quite a affordable structure in every sense of the word. Luke has already put up 1 row of the ground posts. I'm going to show you what I mean by the ground posts. We use these 1-inch fiberglass pieces that we get locally. They're an ideal structure or an ideal piece because they fit snugly within the hoop, as you'll see. They last about 5 years before the sun starts to degrade them. You can pull them out pretty easily and move them to a new place from year to year. So we use them, and what Luke has done is we have, this structure's a little shorter. It's not quite 100 foot, it's 72 foot. He's drawn a string from one end to the other so that we can make a nice straight line. And then he's driven every post in on an 8-foot interval, so they're evenly spaced. 8 foot's about right. You don't need to go any closer than that. And they line up pretty nicely. What Luke and I are going to do now is move the string to the other side after we drive that corner post in and go ahead and put the other side up. The way we square the structure, we really don't use any complex geometry or anything like that. You can do that with angles, but we simply find where we want it to go, the length we want and the width we want, and then we put our 4 corners in. So we have 72 feet of length coming down this way and not quite 14 feet of width. We've got 13 feet 10 inches is what we've opted for here. And I'm just going to drive this in with a rubber mallet. You want to check for straightness. Make sure the post isn't leaning too much anyway. And then you just have at it. Until the post is in pretty solid. Now we've put our string on the outside of each post at the far end and the near end, drawn it very tautly so it makes a nice line, and that tells us exactly where we want to put each post in terms of the distance. The tape, right down here at the bottom, tells us the 8-foot interval, and then I want to drive each post in. So we've got all the posts up, one every 8 foot. They're essentially in pairs. And then what we're going to do next is take the PVC. We use 1 1/4 inch what's called Schedule 40 PVC. It's plastic pipe that is flexible. You have to have flexible pipe. And every one of these pieces, like the one Luke is holding, is 20 foot long. Now you could get 10 foot. I don't know that they make them any longer than 20, but 20 foot allows you to create a hoop that is about 7 foot tall in the middle and about 13.5 to 14 feet of width. And that's what we're looking for here, is a hoop of that size. Go ahead and slip your end over. Don't go all the way to the ground, go about halfway down. That's good. So he's got one end over. I just bend it, bring it to this one, pull it in, and we keep it about that height above the ground. That allows us to have a little more interior height, that 7 foot that we wanted. If we went all the way to the ground, let's do that, Luke. Then you'd have a very low structure. These, by the way, were used on a hoop house last year, so you can see they retained some of their bend, but you don't need that. Normally they're just straight at the beginning and they bend as you make them. That's good. By the way, we had already made these raised beds. For this type of structure, it's much better if you have your beds ready, because once the hoop house is in place, it's a good bit harder. Yeah, pull that up a bit. It's a good bit harder to work inside with the tractor. You can see the snugness that this particular fiberglass gives you. It's quite nice. It's a little bit of a nuisance when you're trying to adjust the height, but otherwise you want that snugness. If you use something like rebar, which some people do, that's fine, but the problem is you can't suspend the hoop off the ground like we can here. With rebar, the hoop automatically has to go to the ground, so you end up with a much shorter structure. If you can't find this fiberglass, you could use 1-inch rigid PVC. It doesn't work quite as well, but it can work. So, voila. Not quite 100 foot, this one's 72 foot, but you can see the skeleton shape of it now. The only remaining steps we have are two. We're going to put a 1x4 board along each side, right at about hip height, and then we'll put plastic from one end to the other, leaving the base open, and then we'll come back with the row cover material, the agrabon or remay, and we'll cover the entire structure with that until it gets warm enough to take that off. We'll leave the plastic on because the tomatoes prefer that. We're going to be doing tomatoes in here, keeping the rain off of them, controlling the moisture, but the row cover will just be on for about 4 weeks until we're past all danger of frost. We use a tech screw, handy little screw that you can use for metal, anything else. It's a self-tapping. You don't need to pre-drill a hole. A little driver, cordless drill, and then we go ahead and put it in here to lock the post into the same spot as just like that, the ground post. Now, it's kind of simple way of getting plastic over a structure when the structure is a little too tall or too broad for you to just walk it across. This works especially, it's especially important in the big high tunnels, more so than these small hoop houses, but it helps with the hoop houses as well. Essentially, you create a handle in the plastic by tying it to a tennis ball. You double the plastic over a couple of times so that when you pull it doesn't tear it. And then you tie it to a good sized rock. And then you use the rock as your leverage to get it over the structure. For the ends, you can secure the plastic a lot of different ways. Some folks build end walls with doors you can go in and out. We have those on our high tunnels, but on these simple low-cost hoop houses, you can use a clamp. They make these metal clamps in different diameters for fitting thicker steel and thinner steel. You can get a clamp that fits the 1 3/8 inch top rail that we have on there, and that will allow it to clamp onto the edge and hold it very securely. You can see how it does here. You put one of those about every 4 or 5 feet. You can put a Tech screw through them for some extra strength, but they're very snug and they hold quite well. What we do get in here is white flies. Now, aphids are easily managed with cilantro. If you let cilantro, and I have some plants that I need to plant in here. I have a lot in the field. Cilantro is one of many, many plants that attracts lady beetles, lacewings, and others. And it's, you know, a beneficial insect habitat plant. And a good lady beetle population will wipe out an emerging aphid bloom very quickly. What I've done for them. They don't do that for white flies. So for white flies, if I get a problem, I usually spray with neem oil and safer insecticidal soap, and those two together seem to control white flies fairly well. Basically, in these tunnels, you get much less disease. You don't get the early blight that's such a problem in the field all around West Virginia, Virginia, Kentucky. You virtually eliminate it. You can get another fungal disease in here called tomato leaf mold, which is similar to early blight in terms of how it progresses. But I've had it a couple times, but we still get a yield for maybe 12 to 14 weeks instead of 16 to 18. But in the field, we might get 4 or 5 weeks, and then the blight has wiped them out. We'll make $8,000 to $10,000 out of a tunnel of tomatoes. We'll make 5 to 7 with the cucurbit. Well, last year we were literally 6 weeks earlier than anybody else, but that was unusual because last year, you probably had it too, we had kind of a warm period towards the end of April, and then the first 3 weeks of May were like early March. It was cold and wet. It was 40s and upper 30s at night. It was 50s during the day. It was ridiculous. So people who had put their tomatoes in the field, they didn't kill them, but they would just sat there for 3 weeks. Whereas we had our tomatoes in these tunnels. We had 2 tunnels of them in one hoop house, and they were growing like it was nobody's business. So that gave us an unusually big jump. So we were picking for 6 weeks. Then the next week, we had 1,000 pounds on the truck Saturday morning. Again, after selling about 250 on Tuesday and selling a bunch to several restaurants, and I thought, I am really coming home with tomatoes. By 11:45, we had sold all 1,000 pounds, plus a bunch of broccoli and cauliflower and zucchini and cucumbers. It was just amazing. Now, if I had been 3 weeks later with 1,000 pounds of tomatoes, I would have come home with a lot of tomatoes, but not then. Big advantages of tunnels, of course, is that you get an early season jump. You see it in these high tunnels, you'll see it in the hoop houses. And this is a great illustration. These tomato plants we planted in the ground as 10-week-old plants around the end of March, 1st of April. And here we are, the 29th, 28th of June, and you see lots of ripe fruit already climbing up the vine. In fact, we've been picking out of here for about 5 weeks. We've really been picking in earnest for the last couple of weeks. We'll take between 300 and 400 pounds of tomatoes to tomorrow morning's market, and I am absolutely certain that we'll have no trouble selling them. We'll probably be sold out within a couple of hours. So the first and probably biggest advantage of going to the time and trouble and expense of building a hoop house or a high tunnel is the earliness of the crop, the better price that you get with that earliness, the fact that your market is all but assured. But it isn't just that. You also can see really nice size, nicely shaped fruit. That's because these tunnels and hoop houses give you a little more of a controlled environment. You have less, not no, but less disease pressure. You tend to have better quality fruit, fewer culls, fewer that you have to pull out. So you just get a lot of good things coming with these tunnels. And lastly, they last. The final advantage, they last longer. Mostly in a year like this year, where it's wet and cool for so much of the time, folks whose tomatoes are out in the field, they'll be succumbing to disease before long, organic or not. In the tunnel, because we kind of keep the weather at bay, we will likely have a tomato crop that goes a lot longer. Started earlier, will last longer than field planted tomatoes. So it was only about 4 weeks ago that we were struggling to get the plastic over this little hoop house structure. And we managed to do it after a couple of false starts. These tomato plants, cherry tomatoes, were already in here at the time we covered them, but they were just about knee height. You can see now, 4.5 weeks later, they're well over my head. They're going over 6 foot now, and we've already begun picking cherry tomatoes. Now this structure, this hoop house, is a metal version of the PVC homemade hoop house. And this one really is inexpensive to build, about $750. And again, gives us many of the same advantages of a tunnel, just a little bit smaller.